Jamaica just shocked Trump and the West. When people think of revolutions, they picture tanks, riots, or leaders shouting into microphones. But on July 24, 2025, the loudest revolution in the Caribbean came with a single, calm word: pause. That day, in Geneva, Prime Minister Andrew Holness stunned the world. He announced that Jamaica would suspend all U.S. migration surveillance partnerships tied to Donald Trump's controversial Executive Order 14204. Overnight, a small island had defied the most powerful nation on Earth. Stay with me, because this wasn't just about visas or data. This was about sovereignty, dignity, and the Caribbean's boldest stand in decades. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, because here we uncover the hidden battles shaping our world. To understand why Holness's words shook the world, you need context. For decades, Jamaica's relationship with the United States has been shaped by migration. Nearly 1.2 million Jamaicans live in the U.S. That's almost 40% of Jamaica's entire population. Their presence has created powerful bonds. Families are split across borders, remittances flow back home, and travel between Kingston and New York or Miami is as common as a domestic flight. But with those ties comes leverage. Washington has long used migration as a political tool. In exchange for visa privileges, customs facilitation, and financial cooperation, Jamaica has been expected to give something in return: compliance. That compliance often takes the form of data-sharing agreements, intelligence exchanges, and participation in U.S.-designed migration control programs. Now, migration partnerships in themselves aren't new. They exist across the world. But in 2025, things changed drastically. President Donald Trump, during his return to office, signed Executive Order 14204, a sweeping policy demanding that any country seeking favorable visa treatment must share real-time immigration, biometric, and residency data directly with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. To Washington, it was about national security and controlling borders. To Kingston, it felt like a direct violation of sovereignty, an ultimatum disguised as cooperation. Picture the scene: Geneva, Switzerland, the Global Mobility and Border Governance Summit. The hall is filled with diplomats, migration experts, journalists, and representatives from dozens of countries. They expect Prime Minister Holness to give a routine address about Jamaica's cooperation in migration frameworks. Instead, Holness steps to the podium and delivers a line that nobody saw coming. This policy goes far beyond legitimate security concerns and disrespects Jamaica's sovereignty. Therefore, effective immediately, Jamaica will pause its participation in these surveillance partnerships. The room freezes. Cameras zoom in on the faces of stunned U.S. officials. Some shuffle papers nervously. Others whisper frantically into their phones. It's not every day that a Caribbean leader stands in front of the global stage and essentially tells Washington, "Enough." The silence in the room spoke louder than the words themselves. Holness had drawn a line, and he had done it in the most public way possible. This wasn't an impulsive act. Jamaica's frustration had been simmering for months. Reports leaked earlier in the year revealed that 37% of Jamaican visa applications to the United States were being denied, an alarmingly high rate compared to neighboring Caribbean nations. Families were being separated, students had to abandon scholarships, and small business owners were losing opportunities because their applications never made it through. At the same time, travelers complained of harsh treatment at U.S. airports. Jamaican nationals often faced extra screening, long interrogations, and a level of scrutiny that many described as humiliating. Back home, activists began to connect the dots. Jamaica was giving the U.S. sensitive data, fingerprints, biometric scans, residency information, yet its citizens were not being treated with dignity. Cooperation looked less like partnership and more like submission. Holness, facing pressure from both citizens and political critics, realized that Jamaica had reached a breaking point. Continuing to hand over data without reciprocity would only deepen resentment. What made Holness's announcement even more powerful was what came next. He revealed that Jamaica would not simply act alone. Instead, it would spearhead a CARICOM technical review committee to evaluate every digital surveillance tool connected to Trump's executive order. This was a bold invitation to the region. If Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, and others joined Jamaica, the Caribbean would form a unified front. A bloc that could no longer be picked apart country by country. For many observers, this evoked memories of the 1970s, when CARICOM leaders collectively defied U.S. pressure and chose to establish diplomatic ties with Cuba. Back then it was about ideology. Today, it was about sovereignty in the digital age. History, it seemed, was repeating itself, with new weapons and new stakes. The timing could not have been more dramatic. Just hours before Holness's speech, the U.S. State Department had released a statement calling Jamaica a trusted partner in border governance. But within minutes of his announcement, that narrative collapsed. The White House stayed silent, offering no immediate reaction. Instead, the U.S. Embassy in Kingston scrambled to release a statement calling Jamaica's move deeply disappointing. It warned that border efficiency, trade security, and emergency response agreements may be reassessed. In diplomatic language, that was a threat. Washington was signaling that Jamaica might face consequences, stricter visa rules, tougher trade barriers, or even slowed financial flows. Holness knew this risk, but his choice to go public showed he was willing to gamble. The question was, would Jamaica stand alone, or would the region rally behind it? In the past, such a confrontation would have played out in diplomatic backchannels. But in 2025, news doesn't stay confined to summits. Within minutes, Holness's words were trending under #JamaicaStepsBack. TikTok was filled with videos of Jamaicans cheering in bars and living rooms. Instagram Reels showed young activists in Kingston painting murals of national pride. Twitter threads debated the meaning of sovereignty in the digital era. By the end of the day, the hashtag had generated over 5 million views, making it one of the biggest political trends in Caribbean history. Supporters compared it to Jamaica's 1962 independence moment. Critics warned that trade and travel could collapse. But regardless of perspective, the fact was undeniable. Jamaica had captured the global conversation. The deeper issue Jamaica raised was this: should visas be treated as neutral instruments of mobility or as weapons of diplomacy? For decades, Washington has used visa access as leverage. Nations that cooperate get easier entry. Nations that resist face denial rates, travel restrictions, and humiliations at airports. This power imbalance has left millions vulnerable to the whims of foreign policy. Holness's move challenged that framework head-on. By suspending cooperation, Jamaica was declaring that dignity mattered more than convenience. A student losing a scholarship is painful. A grandmother missing a family reunion is heartbreaking. But, Holness argued, no amount of visa convenience could justify surrendering sovereignty. It was a radical stance, but one that struck a chord across the region. Of course, boldness comes with risks. Analysts quickly pointed out that Washington had tools of retaliation. The U.S. could delay visa processing, restrict certain categories of travel, or tighten security screenings even further. More dangerously, Washington could affect Jamaica's economy indirectly. Remittances from Jamaicans abroad accounted for $3.3 billion in 2024, nearly 16% of the nation's GDP ***. Any disruption to financial channels, whether through stricter banking oversight or delayed transfers, could hit ordinary Jamaicans hard. Holness knew this. But his calculation was clear: if Jamaica acted alone, it would be vulnerable. If Jamaica acted with CARICOM, the Caribbean would have leverage. It was a gamble not just on principle, but on regional unity. Scholars immediately began to frame Jamaica's decision as a turning point in Caribbean diplomacy. For decades, the region had been reactive, adjusting to policies set in Washington, London, or Brussels. But in 2025, something shifted. From Africa to South America, the Global South was rediscovering its voice. Africa was renegotiating mining contracts. South America was challenging IMF terms. And now, the Caribbean was declaring independence in the digital domain. Jamaica's pause was not just about data. It was about showing that small states, too, could shape global debates. That sovereignty was not a relic of the past, but a living principle worth defending. On that summer day in Geneva, one word, pause, echoed louder than any speech. Jamaica had dared to step back, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Whether the gamble pays off remains uncertain. But one thing is clear, the Caribbean has found its voice again. And this time, it refuses to be ignored. When the news of Jamaica's bold stance spread beyond Geneva, the reactions were immediate and polarized. In Washington, diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout, while in Kingston, ordinary citizens debated what this meant for their daily lives. Some worried that their visa applications might now be frozen, while others felt a deep sense of pride that Jamaica had finally stood up for itself. It was a complex mixture of anxiety and celebration, one that revealed just how deeply migration politics had become woven into Jamaica's national identity. Behind closed doors in Washington, officials were not just angry, they were worried. The United States has always relied on compliance from smaller nations, especially in regions considered its backyard. For Jamaica to defy them so openly, and in such a global setting, set a precedent that could embolden others. If one Caribbean island could challenge U.S. authority, why not a coalition of them? The real fear wasn't just Jamaica, it was contagion. Other countries might follow suit, turning what began as a pause into a regional rebellion. For Holness, the choice was deliberate. He understood that Jamaica was risking its relationship with its largest trading partner, but he also knew that the symbolism of this decision would resonate far beyond his country's borders. To the international audience, Jamaica's message was clear: sovereignty was not for sale, no matter how much leverage Washington tried to exert. He wanted to remind the world that dignity has a value that can't be measured in dollars, remittances, or visa approvals. But the challenges were real. Many Jamaican families rely heavily on relatives in the United States. These relatives send home billions in remittances every year, money that pays school fees, builds houses, and keeps small businesses afloat. Any disruption to these flows would hurt deeply, not in the halls of power but in the kitchens and living rooms of ordinary people. Holness's gamble was that the U.S. would not dare punish Jamaica too harshly for fear of triggering even greater resentment across the Caribbean. It was a high-stakes poker game, and Jamaica had just called America's bluff. Meanwhile, in the streets of Kingston, the announcement sparked an outpouring of pride. For years, Jamaicans had complained about the way their people were treated at U.S. airports and consulates. Videos began circulating online of Jamaicans telling their own stories of humiliation, long lines, and unexplained denials. For them, Holness's stand was not just about politics, it was personal. It felt like someone had finally spoken up for them, refusing to allow Jamaica to be treated as a junior partner with no voice. The global media quickly picked up on the story. Outlets in Europe praised Jamaica for its courage, framing it as part of a wider global South awakening. Newspapers in Africa drew parallels between Jamaica's stance and their own battles against exploitative agreements with Western powers. Even in Asia, analysts noted that small states everywhere were beginning to assert themselves in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Jamaica, an island of less than 3 million people, had placed itself at the center of a global debate. Inside CARICOM, the ripple effect was even stronger. Governments across the Caribbean suddenly faced pressure to clarify their own positions. Could they continue to quietly comply with Washington's demands while Jamaica had the courage to step back? Citizens began demanding answers. In Barbados, talk shows debated whether their government should align with Holness. In Trinidad, unions and civil society groups issued statements praising Jamaica and calling for solidarity. A regional wave was building and Washington could feel it. For Washington, the dilemma was tricky. On the one hand, they could not allow Jamaica's defiance to go unchallenged, or it would encourage others. On the other, heavy-handed retaliation would only prove Holness's point and risk pushing the entire Caribbean closer together. In the past, the United States relied on a strategy of divide and rule, offering small favors to some, while pressuring others into silence. Jamaica's move disrupted that playbook. If CARICOM held together, Washington would face something it had long tried to avoid: a united Caribbean negotiating from a position of strength. What made the situation even more difficult for the U.S. was the optics. The world was watching. If America punished Jamaica too severely, It would be accused of bullying a small island simply for asserting its sovereignty. In an era where the US was already facing criticism for its heavy hand in global politics, the last thing it needed was footage of Caribbean leaders accusing it of neo-colonial behavior. This forced Washington to tread carefully, even as frustration boiled over behind the scenes. Back in Jamaica, Holness's government began preparing for possible fallout. Economists modeled what would happen if remittances slowed or if trade benefits were restricted. Legal experts examined whether Jamaica could challenge U.S. measures at international forums. Diplomats worked phones, securing quiet words of support from European and African allies. The strategy was clear: Jamaica would not retreat, but it would prepare for every scenario. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of isolating Jamaica, Holness's decision boosted its international standing. Within weeks, he received invitations to speak at forums in Africa and Asia. Leaders who had long felt pressured by Washington now saw Jamaica as an example of courage. It was not lost on them that a country with such deep economic ties to the United States had chosen principle over dependency. Jamaica had shown that it was possible to say no, even when the risks were high. The hashtag Jamaica Steps Back continued to trend, evolving from a moment of defiance into a movement. Young people across the region began to rally around it, seeing it as a symbol of modern independence. Memes compared Holness's pause to the legendary acts of resistance that had defined Caribbean history, from slave revolts to the fight for political independence. On university campuses, debates about sovereignty and surveillance grew louder. A new generation was paying attention. Of course, there were critics. Some business leaders worried that the decision might harm investment. Travel agencies expressed concerns that stricter visa policies could hurt tourism, especially since so many Jamaicans travel back and forth to visit family. Opposition politicians accused Holness of playing with fire, warning that ordinary citizens would pay the price if Washington decided to retaliate. The government was walking a fine line, balancing the pride of sovereignty with the practical needs of a globalized economy. And yet, the longer Jamaica held its position, the more it seemed that Washington's threats were bluffs. Visas continued to be processed, remittances kept flowing, and trade remained steady. While there were whispers of behind-the-scenes pressure, the public saw little evidence of serious punishment. Instead, the symbolic weight of the decision began to overshadow the risks. Holness had proven that defiance did not have to mean destruction. By the time the United Nations held its General Assembly later that year, Jamaica's stance had become a talking point in the corridors of power. African leaders congratulated Holness privately. Latin American delegates compared Jamaica's pause to their own struggles with Washington-imposed economic frameworks. For once, Jamaica was not being discussed as a small island dependent on others. It was being respected as a sovereign actor that had influenced the global conversation. At home, Holness framed the moment as part of Jamaica's long history of independence. Just as the nation had once broken free from Britain, it was now asserting itself in a new arena. Independence, he argued, was not a one-time event but an ongoing process. Each generation had to defend it in its own way. For his generation, the battlefield was digital surveillance and migration control. The question that lingered, however, was what would come next. Would Jamaica's pause remain temporary, or would it evolve into a permanent refusal? Would CARICOM truly unite, or would some members eventually fold under U.S. pressure? The uncertainty kept analysts guessing, but one thing was certain: the Caribbean had entered a new era of self-assertion. In the years to come, historians may look back at July 24, 2025, as a pivotal moment. Not because of a war, not because of a treaty, but because of a speech. A speech where one Caribbean leader dared to say no in a world where small states are often expected to say yes. It was proof that power does not only belong to the mighty, that dignity, when defended, can echo louder than threats. For ordinary Jamaicans, the day became a story to tell children and grandchildren. A story of how their island stood tall in Geneva and reminded the world that sovereignty is priceless. Some saw it as a gamble, others as a victory. But all agreed it was a moment that would never be forgotten. And so, the word pause entered the lexicon of Caribbean politics, not just as a temporary suspension, but as a symbol of courage. Jamaica had stepped back, not out of fear, but out of strength. And in doing so, it inspired others to believe that small nations, too, could shape the destiny of the world. So, what do you think? Was Jamaica right to take this risk, or will the cost eventually outweigh the pride? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, the stories shaping our world rarely make the headlines in full. That's why you should like, share, and subscribe, because here, we bring you the truth behind the noise.